Okay, that's better. Great. Hi, I'm Jenn Lin. I'm a senior test lead with the PivotViewer project under Silverlight. Like Jen said, it's very confusing because the program evolved from being part of Live Labs, which was an incubation team, to an actual control that's being published by Silverlight. So it's kind of gone through several different iterations over time. I'm not sure why my slides are projecting really oddly. So I'm going to just restart. Wait, no. Sorry. All right, we'll do it from here because I'm not going to trust it to do full screen. Okay, so what I wanted to start with is kind of talking through what's the motivation behind using PivotViewer as a data visualization tool, show you some examples of it in use, and then kind of walk through how to make a PivotViewer experience that's really compelling for your users. So the reason, some of the values that we put into the control are helping people explore data, especially large data sets that are not intuitive to the human mind, and extract new insights and try to find new knowledge in kind of a diverse set of data. So we find that people, as they're using the tool, start being able to find things that are outliers, which is kind of the needle in the haystack, compare two items against one another, or make a decision based on the data that they see. So I'm going to start with the first example, which is a stock app. My first example is to show off some of the properties of the version 2 of PivotViewer. And the second example will be closer to your hearts. It's a scientific example. So what you see here is the most recent stock data. Because Wall Street closes at 2 p.m. Pacific time, this data won't update as we talk about it today. But this is all being drawn live from Yahoo's data service. So if it were midday, you could see some things going from negative to positive, up and down, things like that. So as you might have guessed, the things in red are the stocks that had a bad day, that didn't do too well today. And the ones that are green are the ones that are positive. And I'll give you a little bit of an anatomy of the control. Here's where we have the metadata for the PivotViewer control and some control sliders, so you can say only show things that were more than 1% positive. And it kind of will just filter out anything that doesn't match the metadata filter you asked for. Everything in the middle, this is kind of the main pane. We set up this particular control so that as you zoom in, you get different visuals. So you can kind of get like the 10,000 foot view, and then the 1,000 foot view, and then the 1 foot view. And kind of get like drill down into the actual specific data about an item. And then lastly, on the right-hand side, you can see there's kind of a more detailed view. I don't think these buttons are hooked up to anything, but basically this can be populated with whatever XAML-defined information you'd like to put in there. So what can you do with this? One thing you can do is you can graph. Here I have it graphed by the industry. So you can kind of get a sense of, okay, you know, as these are popping in, the green ones and the red ones mostly clustering around specific industries. Financials didn't really have a very good day. But, you know, energy is kind of more mixed. Materials had a really bad day. Things like that. So you can kind of get this overall glance view of, you know, what does my data look like? What's the shape of my data? You can see up here that if you sort by percent change, there's definitely going to be some outliers. For example, this one way out in here, Bed Bath & Beyond was up almost 10.5%. So if you started the day holding on to that one, you'll be quite happy to see that they're having a great day. And you can also see that there's kind of this bucket of everything that was down more than 2.5%, and kind of get a sense of what are the outliers on that end of the spectrum. You can also look at trading volume, which is an interesting way to look at things. Citigroup wins with the most trades today. And then next up are Bank of America and Cisco. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a walkthrough of how a user would approach this control. Basically, how do I come in and look at this data set that has, I think it's got about 1,000 items in it, and kind of make some sense of what I'm seeing. I also would like to show you my favorite scientific example. Oh, I've already got it up, right? This data comes from a team down at UCSD, and it's some very, very interesting data. You'll see that this data is much more visual because each of the items is just a photograph. You know, no text for the item. And each one of these items that you see is the spotting of an animal in Tanzania, and this data is captured over several months, just trying to track when and where they're seeing different species in certain sections of the forest. And they have it separated by, what is this, by order, family or order? By order, okay. So basically you can say, like, just show me, you know, rodentia. So when you're looking at this data, they found some really interesting trends. This data is just really cool to me. If you sort the data by, for example, the phase of the moon, you see that there are certain trends. Like maybe certain moon phases get the animals in the mood to go find a buddy, right, a partner. But let's say you just want to look per one species at a time. You'll see that the shape of the data changes pretty substantially. So like this species really clusters around the new moon. This one has kind of a similar shape, and I think this one usually, yeah, like the middle of the month is the only time you'll spot this species. So that was something that they had never seen before. Like basically the researchers had gathered this data and had no idea about the correlations that were found in it by moon phase. You can see something similar with temperature. You'll get obviously some clustering by temperature around, you know, whatever the ambient temperature is most likely to be. But if you look at the sightings by species, certain species are more likely to come out at certain temperatures. So this team is doing environmental research to try to look at global impact of global climate change. And this is just some really concrete data to be able to say, if the temperature goes on average from 25°C to 26°C, this species is just going to have a harder time socializing and therefore procreating. So just really cool data. These are finds that are things they had never seen before and are actually going to lead to some papers that are, last I heard, they were looking to publish in Nature. Well, it's okay. We can take a break for questions here after I've kind of done a little bit of a demo. Yeah, sure.
The images, not this one, the previous example that you've shown.
I can get that back.
Each one is showing up a different image based on the resolution and zoom content, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know you use a deep composer.
Yeah, deep zoom is the name of the composition tool that we use underneath the covers for this control. And what I'll tell you is that the stock ticker one was built against the new Silverlight 5 bits that haven't been released yet. The species data is built against the Silverlight 4 bits, which are available. I'll let you get to the question, but I just wanted to let you know that these are actually slightly different compositions on the back side.
We have done that with higher education institutions of mapping the institution names being more like, and their emblems being the content over there. But the problem we had is we could only do it as a high resolution, save it as an image, and then use it. We didn't know how to use a deep composer properly to have different resolutions and different pages.
Right. And what's nice about the way deep zoom works is that as you zoom in, it actually will make network requests to get the higher resolution image. For example, on this one, it only uses kind of a small resolution. As you zoom in, it'll send off network requests to get the next larger JPEG, basically. The stock data is all entirely defined in XAML. That's a new feature that's coming in the new version of the control. So you won't have to have the deep zoom files. So it used to be you'd have to have this whole several thousand
Files, yeah.
file directory to store the image data. And that was a major blocker for deployment for a lot of our customers.
Because when we're trying to deploy in SharePoint, SharePoint doesn't allow that the long directory structure that it has. So what is the methodology that you have used in the recent this thing? And can you explain us like how it done that?
Yeah, I'll show you a little code snippet later in the presentation. But essentially what you can do is define in XAML what you want to see at each zoom level. So this is just saying, just show me the, the symbol and the delta and the percentage. And so that's just a very simple XAML representation of the data. And then you can have a more detailed representation when it gets larger. So getting back to this view. The data is so slow, sorry. Our application could use some performance tweaking. But basically, so you could have this version of the XAML would be more complicated, so that way when someone's drilling in to really investigate a specific piece of your data set, then they can get richer data, which you present through richer XAML. So yeah, I'll show you the code snippet in a little bit. Yeah?
You hinted that if the markets were open, we would see constant updates.
Yes.
So how does that work? Is it a is it a polling scheme that occurs through here that allows constant updates to occur?
Well, what we did with this application is we, on a timer, query the Yahoo financial database, and that we basically have an item source in Silverlight, kind of the concept of like an item source that you can bind to. So the data set that populates the PivotViewer control is this item source that gets repopulated every so often after we get the response from the network request to Yahoo. So it's kind of a tricky thing. You don't want it totally changing underneath you. You don't want to randomize people who are looking at it.
Yeah, bits and pieces. It'll just, like in bits and pieces, update tiles.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not maybe the best user experience, but we just wanted to see what we could do.
Well, there's one potential I see for for our organization. We have seismic stations all over the world, and they're actually labeled a lot like what you'd see with stocks, up to 5 characters.
Yeah.
What I could picture is that you could actually see a set of stations in a network, and as you zoom down, you get more detailed information about the station. Wouldn't it be cool if, using your update scheme, if it could go to the server every once in a while and get an updated seismogram?
Yeah, and it used to be the first version of PivotViewer required a CXML format. It was a specific XML format to ingest the data. This is much more open data friendly, OData friendly, because since you can just bind to an item source, that item source can be any kind of data, and it can be dynamically updating, and PivotViewer will respond to that.
So when you're changing in the stock thing, when you're changing the colors, where does the business rules define the alerting, like changing the color? Where did you define that?
That's in the Silverlight application.
In the application itself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just basically, you can update the property for the color, and then that's reflected using binding. And
another thing I found out is like, as the same thing in line with the sensor data, which you're talking about, we deal with a lot of NCDC data, which NCDC sensors, buoys, and all the stuff that they have, but they're all related with the lat longs.
Yeah.
So can it be shown? I mean, of course, this has only the columnar presentation and then a regular presentation.
Oh yeah, it's basically there's.
Do you have any graphical representation that you can browse through? This doesn't have that option right now, but that is something that is planned for having a
not
spatial
for this next release,
representation.
But maybe you should send me an email to explain a little more, or maybe we could talk later.
I mean, the theme itself, it's spatial representation of the theme, like having a backend being big maps, and then front end, so you can do the filtering, slice dice, and everything.
We ought to, but don't have that yet. I think that would be a great feature to see. All right, so I'll talk through a little more about the code. My slides are misbehaving still. Okay, so 5 steps for building a great PivotViewer app. First thing is definitely to understand what your data is like. A good app will have either rich data or rich visuals. I kind of showed you one of each of those. The best would be if you had rich for both. If you really had something that used photographs and had lots of rich data. This is how you can instantiate PivotViewer control in Silverlight 5. Not yet released, but this is what's coming. So basically in XAML, you define what you want, you give the PivotViewer name, and you define what the properties are going to be bound to. So these could be any properties. In this case, I'm binding to the sticker symbol name. And then in your CS file for this control, all you have to do is define the data context as, in this case, I believe it's a dictionary of stock quotes that we're binding to. So compare this to anyone who's worked with the first version where you had to actually have deep zoom data, which involves thousands of files, plus CXML, which is an arbitrary schema of XML that our team came up with as a lab. And it's just completely night and day from what we're hearing. People are much, much more satisfied with this kind of development experience. So really looking forward to having that out there in the public this fall. Just wanted to give just kind of an idea of what makes interesting data. You want to have some capacity to filter on the metadata, but you don't want to overwhelm people. You don't want people to have 20 or 30 different filter categories and not really know where to start. And for data like the stock data that's changing dynamically, the sample where I'm talking about the data just popping in left and right, that might be really confusing to people. They might not be able to see that there's an update. But if you think of something closer to how Twitter might notify you that there's new tweets available in your feed, and then you click a button and it repopulates the view. That's kind of what we would recommend people try to do. And once you get your data in place, don't forget the visuals. We like to call our visuals trade cards, just kind of thinking of the sports analogy, how you would have these trade cards that show a little bit about the data, a little bit about their statistics, and the guy's picture. So there's kind of an example. What makes a good trade card really depends on your data. This is really hard to say just one size fits all what would look best. For example, we saw one that was just images. We saw one that had kind of many different levels. Again, these visuals were defined in XAML. The data on the cards will update when you update your data source. And you can add content. For example, your XAML can reference deep zoom content so that it's very deeply zoomable. But it also doesn't have to. So basically, if you had a graph that you wanted to include in the trade card, you could do something like that. Here is the smallest version trade card for the stock app. So all we're doing is just saying we want to match the color of the border with the value change property. And we want to bind the text to the ticker symbol. And it's, compared to going through and using Deep Zoom Composer, again, much simpler. We think people are going to be a lot happier with this new development philosophy. And then the last thing is we recommend you think about different zoom levels. Like I said, you want to be able to see from far away what's the trend. Is it a good day on Wall Street or a bad day on Wall Street? Today was kind of a bad day. Look at medium distances as you're looking at, maybe a crowd of items, not the thousands from the far out view, but, something kind of in the middle. And then lastly, kind of what could the detailed view look like? What could you entice your users with as they're drilling into their data? We get a lot of questions about how many items can you put in PivotViewer. Really, for optimal performance, you want to stick to under 5,000. And that's tough. And I know when we were talking, when we're hearing from the OData guys that they have performance problems above a certain number of rows and columns, it's definitely the same problem. You end up slowing down the user experience. You lose the buttery smooth navigation between views. And another thing that I'll point out is if you have enough items on screen, you lose the ability to have a pixel per item. Like I've seen people try to cram 50,000 items onto a screen, and it's almost comical how little you can actually see. So definitely, if you had some way to pre-filter the data down to, in this example, certain states, and just kind of show the items from that subset, that's probably the best way to present the data to your users. Or you could have a pivot viewer that shows categories of things. Or, like I showed you the species example, they had buttons on the top where you could choose different families. And kind of just give people a way to say, like, I want to see this category only at a given time. Finally, we have one data set that shows populations. And so then you can talk about what is the population of women 35 to 40 who are living in this region of the US. And then just give them one trait card. Basically, 1,000 people equals one trait card, something like that. So just kind of thinking through creative ways to deal with the fact that you can only show so many items at a time. And then another new feature that we're going to have for Silverlight 5 is you can replace the filter pane with your own data. So the left pane, the filter pane is the one on the left. So with your own data manipulation pane. So it's something you could put in there and say, instead of our way of kind of clicking through facets, maybe just have buttons to say, like, show me this subpopulation that would be interesting to your users. And just this is a little bit more about the new features coming in V2. Being able to stylize and customize the control much more closely to match what your other application pieces look like, kind of matching the style. When will it be available? It's available right now, but it's the old version that I just talked down way too much. So definitely, you'll have these slides, and you can get links to get started with the first version, especially if you wanted to prototype something and kind of see how you could fit PivotViewer into your data presentation. I highly recommend it. The next version will ship as soon as Silverlight 5 ships. And it'll be a first-class feature of Silverlight 5. We will no longer have the funny lab status. We used to have people ask us all the time, like, will this be supported in a year? And now I can say, yes, for sure, because it's part of Silverlight. So I just want to open up the floor to questions, and I'm also giving you my email address. So if there's anything that doesn't get covered today, or if you think of something tomorrow, you know, I really don't mind emails, questions. So yeah, does anyone have any things they want to talk about now?
Any request? Anything that you wanted to plug in to play with it?
It's hard at the end of the day.
I know, yeah.
To say, like, let's talk about some questions.
Can we get the beta version so we can try it out?
Oh, if you send me an email, I'll find out if I can get you on the beta program. There's a Silverlight beta program that they run.
Okay, thanks.
Is there an option to do data integration on the fly? Meaning when you, let's say, when you watch zoom out, then you'll show the average of all the objects right now, and when you zoom in, you start getting the details.
I feel like that's something that should be possible, but we didn't really design around it as a scenario. So basically, you could see that, like, one item that represents 1,000 data points, but then when you zoom in, it actually gives you one data point and its video, basically, is what I'm hearing.
Think of think of, you know, the stock indices that you showed.
Yeah.
So when I'm zooming out, I want to see just 100 of those, and now the square will represent the average percentage increase or decrease in the change.
Yeah.
And then when I zoom in, and I don't know, pharmaceutical, then I will start get the names of the specific pharmacies, because what you showed here, all the time I'm watching the same object, just the details of this specific object changes.
Yeah.
Now what I'm asking, if can I do an aggregation of a set of objects, and when I zoom in, I
Right.
start getting the details of the members of this group.
Yeah. What's interesting is there probably is a way to do this. One thing you can do is you can write SAML that paints on top of the square item that is in view. I've never tried this. I really shouldn't be recommending it. I almost wonder if you could put a pivot viewer in that. But I actually suspect that having never tested it, I shouldn't be recommending it.
But then those could be embedded from the beginning. You just
Yeah.
you don't have to show it when it's zoomed out.
That's true.
And then when you zoom in, you select more parameters to show. For example, this one, the decreasing is 7% or 0.7% versus how many others. So you can add that how many others is also in this category. So that data could be added.
So I know for
Not showing at the beginning.
Yeah, I know for sure that you could do it if you had like a button or if you put XAML on top to kind of display more items and more details. I don't think it's quite the seamless experience you're asking for. And to me, that sounds like something we could design around better in the future. But right now, the design kind of encourages you to have one item per visual, and then to just kind of enrichen the experience as you zoom in. So,
Means another scenario I can think about, which we have been dealing with, is university systems, like a collaboration of multiple colleges or the universities becomes a college university system at the state level.
yeah,
So when we define funding levels, we define at the higher levels, we show that if they want to have depth knowledge, they can go individually to each institution.
yeah,
That we can show because each university system has its own template. You can show at the high levels, okay, these systems are pretty doing good. Or
Yeah.
if they have a collaboration between multiple institutions, you can show that way. So
yeah.
that we have seen. So
Okay.
if that is a possibility. I think we can program it in the Silverlight behind the scenes, wherein you average it and show us based on the relationship between the system and then institutions. You can show that map instead of the
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I think
But-
it just has to do with
Yeah.
with doing the pre-processing on your data on the Silverlight side, presenting that to PivotViewer, and then just having PivotViewer be
Yeah.
intelligent enough to then visualize it with the full data when you zoom in.
Which is not possible in the previous version because you need to pre-populate all the images. But
Right,
with
but
this
now
new
this is
version,
Dynamic, so
you can actually create dynamically the images.
Yeah.
But the only problem is how fast is it to create the images dynamically. That's one thing.
yeah. And
yeah.
I'll admit I'm showing bits that are debug, so they're a little slower than what you're going to see. You know, we have some work to do before we ship, so we know that the performance should look quite a bit better as far as visual, like populating these visuals. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, yeah, I have two questions. First is that do you have a list of data sets, data format, or service that you could link within Silverlight? And another question is that in order to support this kind of performance, you zoom in and it's just kind of pop up without any delay. What kind of bandwidth of the network or how fast the data should be served?
Well, on the data side, we actually found that.
Did you run into any problem when you were showing this in the last conference
No.
because of the
Not
network?
really. I feel like
Yeah.
the network data tends to not be the bottleneck. Usually it's the rendering side, the composition side for Silverlight. So usually we're much more worried about things like when I zoom out, you're going to see all that gray. If you zoom out fast enough, it looks pretty bad. That's what we've been mostly worried about. Doing the network requests to populate the data source, we just really haven't seen it be much of a problem for most people. And then what kind of data sources can you use in Silverlight? There's a fairly long list. Maybe if you sent me an email, I could go and get you a comprehensive answer. I'm just worried that if I start naming some, I'll forget half.
Yeah, I know it's. We could have a very, very long data list according to different characteristics. But let's say in general, in the environmental field, we're talking about text data, attributes data, and also the shape file. I think that's been discussed, and also the images, and either image in 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional. So could you handle those data sets as the same as text, or what kind of preparation has to be gone through?
Everything except for the 3-dimensional, we haven't done any experimentation with 3-dimensional imagery in PivotViewer. That's a new feature to Silverlight 5, and we just haven't tried it yet. But everything else you mentioned should be handled fine using XAML binding and using the data source binding. You should be able to reference all those kinds of data. 3-dimensional visuals, I'm not positive. So, yeah.
So those environmental data, I mean, this is one of the matching and dating kind of thing that I did. So I kind of connected one of the scientists with Jenny. Ilya, some of you know Ilya from UCSD. So he couldn't be here today, but he's been working with us. If you have some data you really wanted to plug in, we would be happy to take your real world scenarios and try on. That would be the demo that we'll create for both of us.
Yeah, exactly.
So please go and do
stole
that.
demo.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
More questions?
All right. Thanks, everybody. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, thank
I
you
appreciate
so
it.
much.